Okay, so we'll get started. So thanks everyone for tuning into our webinar today. We are excited to have Dr. Ellen Mallory with us. Dr. Mallory is an extension specialist and professor of sustainable agriculture at the University of Maine. Her research, she conducts applied research and educational programming on field crop production, soil health, soil fertility, and most recently PFAS in agriculture. Our current PFAS-related research projects investigate the influence of soil and plant characteristics on PFAS uptake by forage crops and management practices that might minimize that uptake. She also coordinates the Maine PFAS Agricultural Service Provider Network. So thanks for being with us today, Dr. Mallory, and I'll turn it over to you for your presentation.
Great. Hi. Well, yeah, thank you for having me. This is interesting. I'm very land-based and you guys are the Sea Grant, but we'll see how this goes. I'm going to start my talk. See if I can share my screen. Oh, whoops. Did that go into that weird mode? Oh, well. Um, Actually, I'm going to go back and do it again just because it automatically went into the mode that I didn't want it to go into. Okay. There we go. All right, that just took a minute. Yeah, so thanks for having me. I'm an agronomist, which means I study field crops, crop production, and have um, been working with farmers across pretty much since 2009 in Maine to look at local grain production, better ways to produce grains for specialty markets and soil health and all those things that you talked about. And then kind of found myself in the PFAS world unexpectedly. And that was through some of the farmers I had worked with. So um, this is Johanna and Johanna Davis and Adam Nordell at Songbird Farm. And these are two farmers who I was working with, very exciting. They were expanding. They had grain production, vegetable production. They were expanding their grains and going to had their own mill. They were going to open a bakery. And then in the fall of 2021, I got a call, a message from Adam who said, there's this thing called, they're saying there's this thing called PFAS and it's on our farm and we don't know anything about it. What do you think? And I was like, I don't know anything about it myself. Luckily, they got connected with a colleague who had been working in that area. And then the state kicked in. And so they got the information and resources they needed, but they were heavily impacted and we started seeing other farms in the state as well. They were actually probably the fourth or so. Well, today I am going to give you a very brief intro to PFAS um, and how it makes it into our food system and some of the main response, because as it turns out, unfortunately, we have been some of the leaders in this area just because we've uncovered it first and had to do some of the work that needs to be done. Um, and I'll talk a bit about what our response is now after 5 years in and some of the research that's going on. But so I'm sure that anybody who's on this call has probably heard about PFAS, and so know that they are these compounds that all share this carbon fluorine bond that's incredibly strong, that makes them super persistent. That means that they bioaccumulate in plants and animals and humans, and they're really hard to destroy. I think it's important to note that they're all synthetic. They're all human made. They do not occur naturally, and they are now pretty much everywhere and tested in almost all ecosystems you can find them. And because they have these incredible properties, resisting heat and water and oil and stains, they've been used in tons of products. And so these are some of the products they've been used in. Huge class of compounds. I mean, the EPA says over 14,000. I was actually in the talk where there's so many, like people define PFAS in so many different ways, and this person from the EPA just went through like, well, if you use this definition, there are these thousands. If you use this, there are these. Um, that's way over my head. I'm mostly concerned with the legacy PFAS right now because that's what we're dealing with in Maine. And those would be the longer chain PFOS and PFOA. They've been the most studied. They were phased out in the early 2000s, but because they have longer chains, they tend to persist a lot. The newer PFAS that have been replacing the longer chain are much less studied, but they actually move through the environment a lot more readily. But so what I referred to chain length in terms of naming PFAS, you have um, the number of carbons in the chain makes up the middle of this. So like PFAS, perfluorooctane sulfonic acid, is the octane is that 8 carbon, but if you were, a 6 carbon hexane, et cetera, et cetera. So it's the chain length. And then it's also the end group, the functional end groups. Are they sulfonic acids or carboxylic acids? You can imagine all the over 14,000 names. And then they are of a concern because they have been linked to human health impacts. So increased cholesterol levels, different cancers, reduced vaccine response and immune response, among others. One note, a little side note here, units of measure, when they are measured in liquids, we talk about parts per trillion. Um, when we measure them in soil and like blood serum and plants, we would talk about parts per billion. And this is uh, pretty much just tied to our analytical capacity, or like how much can we detect in these different matrices. Um, it's hard. It's sort of a hard thing to, there's such small amounts. When we're talking agriculture, we're mostly talking parts per million, of nitrate or phosphorus or something. So these really small levels are just a bit of in terms of communicating. It's like, well, if they're so little, why do we care? But they are very impactful in very small amounts. And so primary routes of exposure for a person would be the consumer products that, like our raincoats, our Teflon pans, our pizza boxes, or we could have industrial contamination through air or water, or land application of biosolids, for instance. And then like AAAF or AFFF, sorry, firefighting foams. We just had a spill last summer of those at an Air Force base in southern Maine. And those all either impact us directly or through different channels. When we're talking agriculture and how do PFAS get into food, we're talking similarly. So we have industrial sources that can make their ways into water or sewage sludge, pesticides. Those in this diagram, we're talking about that growing into the soil. Then plants take up those PFAS from the soil in different amounts, and then animals, either we are eating those plants directly or they can go through animals to us via animal products. And there's this recycling. I like this chart or this diagram because it actually shows that recycling of manure back into the soil. Some of the things this diagram doesn't have are like air. Actually, I was surprised to learn that there are some areas in the US where uh, aerial emissions have been an important source of PFAS contamination. Uh, the home, we can't really discount that. We're all washing rain jackets. We're all, like all our products actually contribute to some extent. We also have direct, it doesn't all go through the soil. drinking water for livestock goes directly. And then, of course, what ends up on the soil, let's say through maybe a biosolid application, if it's heavy enough, especially those shorter chain PFAS can move through the soil profile and into water and contaminate the water, so that can cycle back. And then I guess what I'll just say though, that this diagram does very well, and a lot of diagrams don't have, or people don't talk enough about, is the farm worker exposure piece of this. So this is a diagram of PFAS levels in humans at different times. And it basically from top to bottom goes temporally. So the more recent is at the bottom. And you can see this sort of decreasing trend, but I like this graph because it shows the manufacturing workers in Alabama and levels, and these would be blood serum levels in the late 90s. And I'll just say that some of the farmers in Maine have reported that their blood levels are at the same level as industrial workers. So it's a huge threat just from that standpoint. But this, does have a promising trend, and this graph shows that a little more clearly. Like I mentioned, we phased out PFAS and PFOA in the early 2000s, and you can see that blood levels have decreased over time. So that's a good thing. If you turn off the tap, it's good. It's a good strategy. But like I mentioned, there are all these short chain PFAS, shorter chain, that are being produced, and this is a bit of a mess of a graph, but basically it's just showing the increase in unidentified organofluorines in blood over time. So we might just be trading things here. And I'll just, because this is a water crowd and not as much of a land-based crowd, I'll mention this topic because it's getting a lot more. It wasn't on my radar, but a colleague really was hitting it home the other day. It's just that these super short chain, ultra short chain PFAS, TFAs, are increasing in different mediums. So there's in water and rivers, lakes, ponds, oceans, ice cores. This is from before 2010 and after 2010, and when they were increased in use because of some substitutions, not just in agriculture, but primarily in refrigerants. But they're more concerned about this in Europe right now. So this is a report from some NGOs about levels in wine, how to really, communicate with people is something that they would care about. And these are levels, well, anyway, you can see the steep increase starting around a little bit before 2010. And then this is just to report, it's some environmental NGOs reporting this, but it's also the German government put out this report and showing the sources of TFA emissions, and the really tall bar there is refrigerants and blowing agents, and that's the primary source. But pesticides, plant protection products, account for about 20%, at least in this report. And what's happening there is that, and also with the refrigerants, we had problems with certain products, and so we're trying to find other compounds that don't have the same issues. So we had that in agriculture, and these are sort of substitution pesticides, but now we're finding that they also have issues. So, all right, well, but back to the older PFAS, I guess. I thought I'd give you a little bit of a rundown on what happened in Maine and how we have been responding to it. It really became on the radar in 2016 in the ag community when there was a discovery of a farm that had really high levels in soil and groundwater because there was testing of a municipal well next door to the farm. And at the time, it was like, okay, we know this is a problem, but we don't know how much is too much in the soil. So, or in our products, really, it was they tested the milk, and the milk had high levels. And so then the Maine CDC established a milk action level based on toxicological standards that were available at that time. So, and then in 2019, Governor Mills, right after she was elected, established a PFAS task force to look more into the issue, investigate the extent of the problem, and get get recommendations for what things we would need to do. I was on a little panel at the university to talk about what research was needed, so that was part of that report. And then the Department of Ag started doing some milk testing, off the shelf milk testing, which identified a second farm and then a neighboring third farm. And at that time, folks who were doing this realized that all three of these farms had a history of sludge applications. Um, at the same time, then the CDC established this beef action level and a soil screening level. Um, so the soil screening level is the level at which they assume you could exceed the beef action level or the milk action level with that level of contamination in the soil. Uh, and they base that on the available literature, but there wasn't a lot at the time, but the available literature on how much PFAS in particular, makes it from soil into plants and then into animals and their products, so beef or milk. But back to this history of sludge applications, I just want to mention that we had a very active sludge or biosolids program in Maine. Most states did in the 90s. These are some, when I moved into my office in here in 2008, this is actually a photo I took, or a Xerox, a copy. Um, who says Xerox anymore? Anyway, a copy scan. Anyway, that people were promoting it. I mean, extension. My colleague who just retired last year gave me slides from a talk that he gave on how to use biosolids on your farm because they had great fertility benefits, and they improve soil organic matter. So they have really great benefits. At the time when they were doing this, they really only thought about heavy metals and I can't remember what the other one was, and they were testing to make sure. They just didn't, PFAS just weren't, nobody was thinking about that. Uh, and so the state at some point though has like the the biosolid program, you had to get licensed to apply biosolids to your farm, and the state ran that licensing program, and they kept records, and then at some point they put these records online, and so there is a map in Maine. It's not available. Those records are in theory available in every state, but they're not all available online. And in 2021, though, people started looking at this map. I don't know when it was made, but in 2021, when PFAS started becoming an issue, it's like, oh, well, we can, and people were connecting it to sludge applications. Well, we can find out where sludge was applied. And that really prompted a lot of other actions. So the legislature got involved. So they directed the DEP to do a PFAS investigation of all of those sludge and septic sites across the state. There was a lot you saw on the map. They implemented a ban on further land application of sludge, and they established a fund, $60 million, which is a lot, they established a fund to uh, help farmers impacted investigate ways to mitigate, provide financial support. Uh, anyway, we'll see some of that later. But it took a long time to get any of that in place. And so in the meantime, we had two nonprofit organizations, ag organizations in the state, the Maine Organic Farmers and Gardeners Association and Maine Farmland Trust, and they raised money, and a lot of money. People really responded, and they were able to set up an emergency response fund. So helping farmers pay for testing, um, uh, to some extent. Did they have income replacement? Possibly. Now they do. They have. Well, they have a variety of programs, mental health support. Anyway, they're now operating sort of like especially on the testing, they're operating as a confidential source for testing now that the PFAS fund is up and running. But they were really critical in providing the support that people needed in that before the PFAS fund got going. They also, a number of researchers started working on research on farms, affected farms, to try to like, okay, are those soil to plant transfer factors? Is that what we're seeing in Maine? What happens, with the animals if they're on feed, if they're off feed? A lot of questions that needed to be answered and are still being addressed. And then, like I said, the DP started the statewide investigation, and they divided their task into tiers. So tier one was the sites that had the highest levels of sludge application and were close, like within so many meters of residential ground, like wells and things. So they prioritized, and they and started testing water and soil. Um, and then later, the Department of Ag has taken on more of that testing actually on the farms. And so in 2022, the Department of Ag was able to hire their response staff. There were fact sheets and other information coming out for farmers who were concerned. We established the PFAS Ag Service Provider Network. So that's a group of folks who work directly with farmers on any PFAS issues. So those are people from MOFGA and Maine Farmland Trust and the Department of Ag and the CDC and the DEP and an extension, crop advisors, some farm credit unions. We have Grocers Association rep on this. And these are all people we meet once a month to make sure we're all up to date on what's going on and providing consistent information to people, and looking for gaps where there might be either support or information that's needed. So that's ongoing, and we invite people to come talk to us, like you guys have me talking to you. So, and then extension in just last year, launched this navigator program, and those are folks who just help farmers find the resources that are out there, and make sure they're plugged into what's available. We did have our first ever legally enforced PFAS drinking water standard, federal standard that came out last year. And this year, I'd say one milestone is that part of the PFAS fund is to offer impacted farms to sell their farm to the state, and they just completed their first land purchase. I think two, actually, just recently, and are working on some others. All right, so but let's launch into some of what we've learned early on, because that was part of that response, is a lot of learning, a lot of just taking samples and looking at things and trying to figure out what's going on. One thing that was apparent right away is that PFAS are not all the same. This is a list of different PFAS compounds on the y-axis, and you can see that PFAS is definitely our most prevalent. Well, this is just one sample, but it is our most prevalent and abundant uh, PFAS across the sites where we've had those historic sludge applications. But the different PFAS themselves move through these um, media differently as well. So uh, some of the PFBA, which is a four carbon chain PFAS, wasn't showing up in the soil at this site, but did show up in the grass, but didn't show up in the milk. And there's some interesting things like that. Anyway, um, this is a super busy graphic from an article, and it's there's a lot going on, and it just, to me, it actually represents how incredibly complicated this whole thing was when I started um, getting involved and thinking about doing work on this. There are a lot of factors affecting PFAS uptake and accumulation in plants. Some of those are the contamination source and the different types of PFAS. Um, some of those are the plant itself. We'll look at that in just a sec, a little bit more. Um, some of them have to do with root microstructure, etc. Some of them definitely have to do with the soil and soil characteristics that you can see. But let's just zoom in a little bit so we could get rid of some of the busyness and talk a little bit about a little in more detail. So let's just assume we've got PFAS in the soil. It interacts with the soil organic matter and other compounds that, so like iron and aluminum oxides. There's a whole host of things that could be influencing whether that PFAS is available for plant uptake. Uh, and and then whether or not the plant takes it up. So this plant that you see, one of the reasons it's so busy is that the authors really piled every kind of plant you could agricultural plant you could imagine onto one individual plant. So you can see it's got a taproot and fibrous roots, and oh, there's a tuber as well. Like there's no plant that looks like this, but it's good for demonstrating. It's got a grass leaf, but it's also got a forb leaf, and it's also got a grain head. There's no like tomato fruit up there, but you could imagine the grain is like the reproductive structure. And what we see in general, I think the most important thing about PFAS movement, or the, yeah, it's not the most important thing, but it's a trend that we could use to our advantage, I think, is that PFAS tend to accumulate in a plant uh, in the vegetative portions, at least in the upper and the above ground portion, because it goes through the plant through it's pulled through via transpirational flow mostly, and kind of like a straw. You're just sort of sucking it up out of the soil when you're transpiring out of the plant. And that transpiration occurs out of the leaves more so than out of, say, a grain head here, or a tomato, or an apple. And so we've seen in the literature and in our own samples that we can have pretty high levels in the vegetative part of the plant, but almost nothing detected or completely non-detects in our grain, say corn, wheat, oats, peas. Um, and so we can use that as a mitigation strategy for farmers. Let's see. All right. Just trying to see what time it is. Doing good. Okay. Uh, Another busy slide, but it does illustrate what I was just talking about. So this is a chart from a really heavily contaminated site in China, and so these crop concentration levels are pretty darn high. But and the types of PFAS that they have there are really different. It's like an industrial site, very different than what we were dealing with in Maine. But if you go down and look through this, you can kind of see that the ones that are really high are like carrot shoot is so much higher than carrot root, or radish shoot is so much higher than radish root. Over on the right-hand side, the wheat leaf and the wheat husks are higher than the wheat grain, same as the corn leaf and corn husk and corn grain. And we've totally verified that in Maine as well. So another thing that folks learned early on was that PFAS, even though they're forever really, but they're not forever at the individual level, in the sense that when you stop being exposed to PFAS, like in this case, if you stop feeding cows contaminated feed, eventually they will depurate, which was a new term to me. They will eliminate that PFAS from their body, and PFAS in the milk will go down. And so this is another key mitigation strategy, is trying to um, reduce what's going in. Eventually you'd be able to, if your milk levels can get down low enough, you can sell that milk again. And yeah, okay. And then the other mitigation strategies that people are, started using and are using are like installing water filters, changing their source for watering animals or irrigating, changing crops, switching fields so that they're fields that are higher, you would not grow perennial forages. You would switch more to corn grain or somewhere in the middle, because the uptake and accumulation rates are higher in perennial forages than in corn silage, than in corn snaplage. Snaplage is like the ear um, with the cob, husk, and kernels on it, and then corn grain is just the kernels. Or if you're a vegetable farmer, you leafy greens accumulate a lot more than tomatoes, broccoli, or beans, for instance. One farm that I know has focused more on their ornamentals on their higher PFAS fields. So you would dilute your contaminated feed, or you would use clean feed during critical times. So uh, for beef, for instance, if you're finishing beef, you would make sure they go on to pasture that is clean pasture, and they have a period of time where they can depurate, and then when it's time to slaughter them, harvest them, then the levels in their beef, in their muscles, are low enough that they're safe for consumption. Same can be used for milk. Um, And so where are we now in terms of responding to farmers? So this is like just a 1, 2, 3 of kind of how um, we would like triage a situation. So somebody calls, it's like, what, I'm worried about this. And it's like, well, is there a reason for concern? So you try to look at their farm records and you go on the map. Um, the map has all sorts of more information on it. So this is a zooming in to an individual farm. Well, a couple farms, I guess, but you can see that there are fields that are delineated, and those are ones where we've had soil samples taken. Or so yeah, the blue is where a soil sample was taken, the yellow was a confirmed spreading, red, pinkish is unconfirmed spreading. And then you can click on those fields and you can see if they were what their license was for, and then on like the second page, it'll often show you what the levels were if they were sampled, what the PFAS levels were. And then also this shows wells, and whether the wells tested above or below drinking water standards. So this has become an incredibly important resource for people. And then you have to look at, well, how much is too much? Okay, back to that question again. So like I mentioned, I circled, this is Maine screening levels dealing with everything, not just agriculture, but the ones in red are for those are action levels for milk and beef. The ones that were where those are considered above those levels is considered adulterated and not suitable for sale. And then below that are some soil screening levels with different scenarios of how you might be feeding your animals. But the most conservative screening level is 6.4 parts per billion for soil, and that's being used as just across the board. Okay, if we see a level above 6.4, that's when we should go and investigate further. It's just a screening level. It's not an action level. It's just a, should we look at this further? And we only have these levels right now for milk and beef, but the CDC is working to develop more of those for other um, vegetables, eggs, other products. And then we would say, okay, well, if you do have an issue, where can you get some help? And this is just a matrix of what resources are available for Maine farmers and gardeners. So there are a lot of us, and yeah, so in the columns are the state agencies, the Department of Environmental Protection, the CDC, the Ag Department. Our private crop advisors have been really important. Extension, and then I can't see the last, but I'm assuming it's our nonprofits. So it just everybody's providing information. Some of us are providing soil and groundwater testing. Um, uh, Many are doing technical assistance and recommendations for how to mitigate an issue. If there A lot of farmers and gardeners have questions about their own health, and so that's being addressed by the CDC. There's a lot of different types of financial support for soil testing, infrastructure. Like if you need to pivot your farm to something else, say I work at a hay farm now that they don't grow hay on those fields because that accumulates a lot of PFAS. So they've moved to growing peas and grains, and the state gave them some support for buying the equipment that they would need to make that switch. There's income replacement, like I mentioned, physical and mental health support, and how to navigate these resources. So, so where are we? After 5 years, we have about like less than 90 farms that have different levels of contamination, but those farms all had at least one water or soil that was above either the drinking water standard or the soil screening level. 5 farms have closed, 3 have reduced their operations, but most of these farms have remained in production. And the solution on every farm is different, and it's really taken the Department of Ag working individually with these farms to develop those solutions. So luckily, we found our worst situations with the tier 1 testing, and so what's all the testing that's going on now is really um, not we're not getting too many new um, high level hits, I guess you would say. Um, most, yeah, okay, we'll leave it at that. But I will say one of the farms that discontinued was the farmers I talked about at the very beginning at Songbird Farm. And they just felt that while their grains, as it turned out, tested all non-detect, their vegetables were high, and they just didn't want to stay on the farm for their own health. And Adam is now working for Defend Our Health as a PFAS resource person, and he's been really great advocating for farmers and helping other impacted farmers deal with the issue. And I think, yeah, his quote that really hit me was just that, he said, "I'm unlucky that this happened to me, but I'm lucky since it did that it happened in Maine." And I feel all of us who have been working on this has been, it's been really hard. It's frustrating because there isn't enough information and there aren't solutions all the time. Um, but it's been really sort of humbling in how much people have come together to try to address this. So, and that has then really spurned a lot of research because we just don't have that information. And so there, I just thought I'd highlight just a few things that are going on research wise, um, to wrap up. So, and I categorized them into sort of three areas: risk assessment, remediation, and mitigation. So in terms of risk assessment, this question of how much PFAS in the soil is too much. So this is a project that I'm doing with the Maine CDC, and colleagues at MOFCA and Department of Ag and DEP, where we are looking at the transfer factors, so the amount of PFAS in this case in the soil that makes it into the plant, um, across a whole bunch of different sites, that are in perennial, like hay, basically hay fields, and uh, measuring the transfer factor, but then also looking at all these other factors, soil factors like soil texture, clay, sand, silt, uh, pH, organic matter, cation exchange capacity, oxides, and then plant factors like the species, their growth stages, some of these like plant quality factors that could come into play. So far, we have a big data set, and I think it's taken a lot to get it all compiled. Some of the things that we see are potentially important precursors. Actually, that's not on this list, but the fact that when there are PFAS precursors in the soil as well as PFAS, so precursors would be compounds that transform either chemically or microbially into PFAS itself, that those have been have a high association with high transfer factor. That kind of makes sense. Aluminum and iron oxides were actually something that popped up when I did an initial analysis. Organic matter I thought would be a slam dunk, but over all of these sites, it hasn't. I haven't seen a significant um, association. Close, but not super significant, I guess. So, but we're still working on that. Also in this risk assessment is looking more at milk and beef models and trying to capture the dynamic nature of those levels over time, or what an animal eats. And so recognizing that it's pretty complex. You can't just use one factor for how much goes from the soil to a plant to animal, because the animals are on pasture, sometimes they're on feed, they're on different types of feed, they're lactating, sometimes they're not. So the CDC is working with other researchers to develop some models, and they've had some pretty good success with beef. So that's cool. In terms of remediation, the thing I hear all the time is, well, can't we just plant something and suck it out of the soil and then take that plant? And well, nobody has a solution of what to do with that yet, but there are some destruction technologies that are being researched. And I think that that's not such a bad idea for short chain PFAS. And this is a study that was done in northern Maine, and they found that they found pretty high levels of uptake with hemp, with some of the shorter chain PFAS, but very low levels of uptake in the longer chain. And so when we're dealing with these legacy sites that are mostly PFAS, or these lower or longer chain PFAS, it would take hundreds and hundreds of years for plants to be able to take those up. And I mean, that's evidenced by the fact that after, since the 90s, now, there are farmers that have been haying fields and hauling hay off and haven't, we still dealing with really high levels. Um, so there's some promise, but not for everything. And then we're also looking at mitigation options. So a graduate student just finished a study looking at intercropping vegetables. So if you plant tomatoes with lettuce, or tomatoes with tall fescue, a grass, would that reduce the levels in the tomato? She only found effects for this PFBA, which is a shorter chain, 4-carbon chain PFAS. This is just what was found in the fruits individually, but what I just saw, their paper came out, and they did see a bit of a reduction in the tomato fruit when it was planted with lettuce, but not with the grass. So, but their paper is out. If anyone's interested, let me know. I can get that to you. And then I'm working with my student on looking at different strategies and how we would manage our forage crops. So those could be annuals or perennials, grasses or legumes. So what different species could you grow that might reduce the amount of PFAS in harvested forage? What growth stage do you harvest them at? Cutting height, cut number. We've seen that our second cut. So um, you, we'll be cutting first cut in a couple weeks, but then the plants regrow, the perennial plants regrow, and you take a second cut, and that the levels are um, 50 to 400 times or 500 times higher in the second cut than the first cut, depending. Yeah, there's a huge range on that, but it's generally always higher in the second cut. So we'll be working on that. And then I think the most immediately promising strategy is trying to immobilize the PFAS. So this is a study looking at biochar on plant uptake, and they found promising results. These were really high levels of biochar. So we were initiating some on-farm trials to see what we might achieve with more reasonable rates of biochar application. And then on the right is the results, preliminary results from a feed binder study. And one of those binders in particular really showed great affinity for PFAS, or I think it's PFAS in this case too. And I mean, this is a strategy that's been, this binder has actually been used in with animals for like mycotoxins in feed. Um, so that's good. So there are some promising things, but we just need a lot more research before we're going to have really effective solutions. So with that, I will you can read my acknowledgments, but there's been a lot of different people and funding involved in what we've done, what I've done so far. I don't have everyone else's on there. And yeah, I'll take any questions that people might have.
Thank you so much, Ellen, for that talk. That was so interesting to hear. I did not know so many of these things, so thank you once again for sharing that.
Sure.
Um, we do have one question in the chat from Gavin, and the question is, do we know if crops uptake PFAS differently from what's found in water versus found in the soil?
Oh, like hydroponic production, perhaps.
Yeah, I guess that too, and I guess
Yeah.
in general, the uptake. Uh,
Yeah. I mean, yeah. Or like, yeah, I don't know so much about that because I only deal with land-based production. I would think that what you might see is what PFAS are there in the water versus the soil and how they interact. So because the soil is just, there's so much interaction that happens in the soil with the PFAS that affects what's available for uptake, and you wouldn't have that as much in a hydroponic system. But the actual mechanism from root hairs and into the plant, I guess I don't know how that would be impacted. I would think it would be similar, but I don't know. I will say one of my extension colleagues is involved in a project looking at low cost sensors for hydroponic systems so that people could um, find where they have contaminated water more quickly. PFAS testing right now is, I didn't mention this, but it's super expensive. It's like, yeah, like upwards. Well, it just depends on what test you use, but it's definitely like $250 a sample, if not up to well above five. And so that I didn't mention, but is a really active area of research is just trying to find lower cost testing so we can screen a lot more.
I have a question. When you were talking about the perennials, looking at like the first cut and the second cut, you said that the second cut was higher.
Yeah.
And I'm having a hard time kind of like you would
Yep.
think that that first cut, it would suck it all out, you'd get rid of it, and it would regrow in soils that have less PFAS.
Yes. Well, so it
Not
goes
the
back
case.
to like that that is a good point. And I have to say I'm so focused on PFAS, this long
Mhm.
chain one that is has been there um for a couple decades, right? So plant uptake hasn't removed it from the soil. You still get worrying levels in the plant, but we haven't exhausted it by any means. Or you can get worrying levels in the plant. I won't say you, but so we have there are a couple of theories about, we've thought about why this might be the case, and we're looking into some of them. The one that gets the most traction, I think, is just that, remember that weird plant, like with the transpirational flow, we know that PFAS is going into the plant largely through transpirational flow, and so driven by transpiration of the plant and sucking it from the soil, basically. And so our first cut, which, like I said, is going to happen in a couple weeks here in Maine, and we've had pretty cool weather. So the plants probably aren't transpiring as much as by the time we get to second cut in June, July, it can be really hot, and those plants have transpired a lot. That also, though, if you're a forage agronomist, you would say, but wait a minute, what about leaf to stem ratio? And I'd say, oh, I didn't actually think about this until a couple years ago. But apparently the leaf to stem ratio of perennial grasses changes from first cut to second. It changes forage quality, and that's why um, people are interested, forage agronomists are interested in that. But it could also affect the PFAS concentration in the harvested forage, because if you have more leaves, that's where we see more higher PFAS or PFOS in particular concentrations. So that could be affecting it.
Thanks, Ellen.
Yeah.
Another question I received is that the mitigation strategies you listed are all ways to work around high levels of PFAS, but are you aware of any cleanup efforts that might be going on to support these farms?
Yeah. So it's really hard to think of how to clean up an agricultural field. Water, it's like, filter, it's so, even the filters are expensive. At least it's kind of possible. But first you have to isolate, I think in a water system, like at the water treatment facilities, what they're trying to do is isolate the PFAS through different mechanisms. Like foam fractionation is one that I think is pretty cool. You just bubble it, and the PFAS like to be at the water air interface, and so they end up in the foam, and scoop that off, and then somehow you separate it, and then you have a higher concentration, and it's it's costly. I don't know. It's more cost effective to then try to destroy it somehow, because the only destruction technologies that are working uh, are, are like high heat. Maybe there's some chemical reaction as well that accompanies it, but you have to heat it up really, really high, and that's super expensive. So one, we have the problem of scale, like just how could we treat that much? But but first we have the problem of isolating it, or um, so if it were a like industrial contamination site, or it's something contaminated with like firefighting foam, then they would probably excavate and do some soil washing type thing. But for farm fields, that's just not feasible.
I actually have a question related to that.
Yeah.
So was there any kind of pushback or hesitancy to test farms in the state just because kind of dealing with it once it's found is such an issue?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are probably farms in the state that have done their own testing, and haven't said anything uh, about the results. I mean, or there are farms who aren't, they're not on the DEP list, but maybe they just don't want to know, so they're not going to test, or, I mean, I think that's totally understandable. And the approach in Maine has been, if we have a support system in place for farmers, then we will have people more likely to test. Not all farms are going to test, of course not. Or but if you don't have a support system, if you don't have no financial support, no technical support, no testing support, just even paying for a test, you can't expect people to do it voluntarily, and you just can't. And so I think that's what we've been seeing in other states as well. It's just like, what's the motivation to test if all it's going to do is really bring you a lot of trouble, and there's no support for you. The other thing is really that there aren't any federal, a lot of states are just waiting for a federal standard. Like, how much is too much? And um, if there isn't, i- yeah, like we have these standards in Maine, but we're the only state that has those. And so what if you do get a test back and you're just kind of left like, well, I don't know. Is that dangerous? Is it not? Is it acceptable? So that's another level where we could use some progress in terms of dealing with the issue, is having some idea of when it's okay and when it's not.
The graph you showed about the study from China, I think it was that you mentioned, which had the different species and the different plants and the parts of them. That was very interesting to see. And you might have mentioned this, and I might have missed it. Are there other studies which have drawn these conclusions at a broader level, that there are certain groups of plants which accumulate more PFAS than others? Do we know anything about that?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Yes, there's actually research out of Colorado. Blaine et al. Is one of the first people in the US to publish some of those studies, and they on vegetables and different vegetables, and different uptake. And then what we're hoping to, that's why we're doing this forage management, the one that was the drone photo of all the different types of forage crops. So I mean, there are a number of studies that talk about the like where we can be pretty confident that vegetative parts are going to have higher concentrations than reproductive parts, because we've seen that over a lot of these studies. Not as many of them, though, have been done in the field, and so that's where I thought, as a field agronomist, that I could help, just to verify those greenhouse studies, and also provide some very Maine-based data, so that we have more confidence in it. But yeah, I feel like that's a very promising area. I mean, like that Songbird Farm, they once they found contamination, they had a grain CSA, actually, and they and then a mailing list, and people would they would mail order cornmeal, for instance. My sister-in-law used to get cornmeal from them, and they send out an email to everybody and just said, look, we found this on our farm. We we don't know if this is safe to eat or not, but we advise you not to. And um, but then, and their vegetables were testing pretty high. But they in the end, their samples came back. I don't know if they're non-detect or super low, and our results would verify that as well at the site we did. So that's encouraging. That gives people, it doesn't clean up the problem, but it does mean that it's not spreading from that field if you're growing, say, corn grain or pea grain or whatever. It gives people an option. And it also, for a livestock farm, it means they could produce something that they can feed their livestock on their farm. They would have to bring in hay, And it's not, I guess it is important to say it's not a solution for everyone. We have a number of hay farmers, and that's what they do is they just make hay, and they're like, and you're going to tell me that I need to have all this corn equipment now, and I have hay because I have really heavy soil and it's on a hill, and so having it in perennial hay is a great solution. And now I'm supposed to till it up and have erosion and all that. Anyway, it's not a solution for everyone, but it does provide some folks with options.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Mallory. We're right at the top of the hour. So I've learned a lot. So thank you. Just a reminder to our Sea Grant PFAS DOP colleagues that we have a second webinar on Thursday at 2 p.m. Central, 3 p.m. Eastern Time. That will be with Dr. Jarrett Liddy from Harvard University, and he'll be talking about disparities in contamination by PFAS in the United States community water systems. So again, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us.
Thanks for
And
having
that
me.
will wrap up our webinar.
All right. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.